G'day Legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. Now, as I'm filming this, there is said to be more Russian Bears, which are Tu-95 aircraft, have just taken off, and it's currently midnight in Ukraine. And these aircraft are some of the aircraft that are responsible for these long-range attacks by both drones and Kh-22 missiles into Ukraine as well. So this is going to be now over 20 nights in a row that is highly likely coming for another barrage of drones and missiles. And this video here, I think it's very difficult on video to actually show the scale of things, but this is a crater from one of these Kh-22 missiles. So we see this here, and the good scale of the men down in it as well. The impact of this, and you could imagine the damage that this can do to anything, whether it's something fortified, whether it's a house, it doesn't matter. These have a lot of bang in them. Now, this is the ongoing fight of attrition of Russian missiles and drones versus Ukrainian air defense. And at some point, one will start lagging behind. Either the more missiles and drones will start slipping through. Yes, I know that not all air defense is 100%, and the most defended region is Kiev, and other areas aren't as defended, or that there's going to be a severe lack of missiles and drones for, future offensives by the Russians as well, and future launches against the territory of Ukraine. So both sides can't keep this up forever. At some point, it's going to have to give. Now, I believe it is very obvious that Russia has 3 missions with the huge increase of these strikes. Now, the first, to me at least, is being to deplete the Patriot and other air defence stocks, not only from the use, but also then encroaching on the budgets for other systems. So part of wearing down these systems isn't just not having the missiles, it's that then the missiles, which are about $3 to $4 million each one, are going to have to be restocked. And if, Russia can take out, let's say, not take out, if Ukraine has to fire 10, for instance, and there's $40 million to then replace them on somewhere else when the US is giving, an aid package of $100 million, say $40 million, which could have been tanks or aircraft or weaponry, whatever, has to then go into the Patriot system. So I believe there's a little bit of that as well, as air defense, like it says, is defense. Is it going to be used, at least around Kiev, in offensive measures? Not really, depending how you look at offense and defense, but we can talk about that more further. But number 2 is targeting the control centers and staging areas for offensive action build-up. So where are the commanders who are making decisions? Where are the tanks? Where are the troops? Things like this, and trying to strike those, because as we know, it's easier to cut the head off a snake. It is easier to try and hit a barracks than try and kill the 200 soldiers out in the open. And Russia's had a lot of issues with this as well, of not having those areas secured and air defense within their territory, but it goes the other way as well. And building up into these offensives, you're going to have large build-ups. Now, some people will say all the Western equipment is already destroyed. There is no evidence of that at all. But number 3 is to again have the population in fear and lower morale. And even if this is just a lack of sleep, when I was in the war early on, just the air raid siren every 30 bloody minutes, all night, gets exhausting very quickly. Getting up, getting out of bed, going down to the shelter, doing that just again and again really does have an effect. Now, what success are they actually having with this? Well, we're having very, very mixed reports. But if Russia does strike high-value assets, there is no way those photos will be released, or information if they have been destroyed or whatever as well. But we don't know. We know that the air defense is being very successful, although not 100%. But we also know that there's a lot of targets too, and that a lot is slipping through. Zelensky has told the Wall Street Journal in a 10-minute interview, you can watch that fully online as well, when he was asked about counteroffensives, he has said, "We are ready to do it, and that we strongly believe we will succeed." But he has spoken also, everyone knows a counteroffensive without air superiority is dangerous. Some of my friends who are working in Ukraine in some different roles have said to me, it is my view that the Western support for this without reform would constitute criminal negligence that unnecessarily endangers lives. Basically saying that if the West have backed a counteroffensive and an offensive but have not supplied the necessary equipment, he believes that this meets negligence for those advising. Ukraine may be able to control the airspace over Kiev, but in areas of which the offensives will be taking place, there's going to be far less less air defense and significantly less advanced systems. We're not going to see Patriots move from Kyiv onto areas at the front, and Russia will absolutely have the advantage in the air by helicopters, planes, EW, you name it. That will be the advantage, and they believe that this could be absolute criminal negligence of rolling these guys into this without that cover. And Zelensky has also spoken about how it would feel being a soldier knowing that that isn't there. UK MOD has spoken about Wagner Group again, and let's read this. Is the most recent update. Russia has continued to redeploy regular units to the Bakhmut sector as Wagner Group assault detachment complete their withdrawal to rear areas. Russian VDV airborne forces have assumed an increasingly important role in Bakhmut. Elements from the 76th and 106th divisions and 2 additional separate VDV brigades are now deployed to the sector. Now, we did know that in the remaining, say, 8 weeks of Bakhmut, before it fell, that the VDV did take up positions from the Wagner assault brigades on the flanks. So the VDV, as well with the TOS-1 Alpha and other artillery system as well, took up the flanks to relieve Wagner forces, so then Wagner could push through the centre as well. And now the VDV, who are an airborne force, so above normal conventional unit, has rolled in and taking up those positions according to this. Now the VDV is much degraded from its pre-invasion elite status. However, Russian commanders have likely attempted to maintain some of these still relatively capable units as uncommitted reserve, because they have instead been forced to deploy them to hold the front line in Bakhmut. The whole Russian force is likely to be less flexible in reacting to operational changes. So there's a few bits in this to break down, and I wish that the MOD gave more clarification on some of this. They should, instead of doing this, they should make it 10 pages long. They've got the people to do it. What else are they bloody doing? But that it's degraded from pre-invasion. Now, we know that VDV took very, very high losses on the initial invasion of Ukraine, especially places like Hostomel. The VDV landed there and it took the airfield very quickly, but then it sort of fell to shit from there. Now, there are some interesting bits about this, because from the GoPro footage, whatever, you can tell from the GoPro footage these guys know what they're doing, and that's from a soldier that, I can watch another soldier and go, oh, they know what they're doing. So when they say then that they are from the elite status, whatever, we'll take that they really do know what they're doing, but they took huge losses. What I will say is it sort of went to shit on Hostomel. There was a lot of footage of them loading up on planes to jump in as far as traditional airborne, but then sort of came air assault on helicopters, and then the exfil from there went to shit, because these guys should not have come in, taken and held. They were there to come in, take another unit, then come in with armour and then hold it from there. So that sort of went to shit. But we're talking about degraded from pre-invasion status. I think in this, there's this assumption that the war hasn't been going on now for 18 months. I'm sure there has been a push to refill the positions of guys lost in these battalions as well. Now, I don't have the intel that the MOD will have, but I would assume that they have tried to refill those positions, and you've got 18 months to retrain guys to a fairly good standard. And we're going to go on about more of this on time and that in a second. The redeploy front line, the whole Russian force is likely to be less flexible to reacting to operational challenges. And this talks about, because they've got less forces in Bakhmut as well. But I think it is important to say that the forces that took the main losses in around Bakhmut, at least for the past 4 months, let's say, were Wagner PMC, not traditional conventional forces. So did this give roles like the VDV, other areas, time to, deploy off the front line, go back, train, re-equip, do whatever, and come back into these positions? Did Wagner PMC give other units some respite from this? The Wagner PMC is still separate from the conventional force, and if Wagner has taken up an area, that relieves the conventional force in other bits. This is where we're probably going to see Wagner PMC deploy near Belgorod and protect that border area where we have seen many cross-border attempts. Now, speaking of the cross-border attempts, I'm going to speak a bit about this with the Russian Legion, maps, whatever. We're going to talk about this. The incursion here, so from War Mapper, and this is really the only map I've seen that actually show this incursion. So this is just to the south of Belgorod. Of course, the yellow is Ukrainian territory, the clear is Russian territory, and have made this crossing into this region here. Now, at time of filming this, I believe that the incursion has now finished. But this incursion did look like they rolled in with more heavy weaponry, at least one tank and some properly armoured vehicles as well. Now, Russian sources have released footage, and I can't show that of course, but appearing to show neutralised Legion troops on the ground with shooting marks, although this can't be verified. And the Legion have released a few statements on some of their official networks as well. So we can look here. The situation from the front lines of the liberation of Russia. We are active fighting on the outskirts of the village Novaya Dolotsky. Unfortunately, there are legionnaires wounded, but the freedom is gained through blood. All the wounded have already been taken to hospital. The regime troops, being the Russians, just near Asgravaron, do not take into account the civilian population. Artillery fire is being used to cover any points where the movement of the legionnaires and RVC is detected. Near Tavolsanka, the enemy destroyed a Renault car with civilians, mistaking it for one with our sabotage group. At least 2 civilians were killed, and this is direct consequence of the unprofessionalism of Putin's army. Strongly advise civilians not to leave their shelters and wait for the end of hostilities in your area. We will bring peace home. Russia will be free. And we do know that there has been a lot of shelling into those areas as well, out of Ukraine, and as well artillery systems brought in from Russia too. So continuing here, our tank with the flag of Free Russia in the village of Novaya near Shaboku. Good morning from homeland, let's keep fighting. And they claim that this is their tank, and you can see the flag on it here. So we know that there was at least one heavily armoured vehicle being a tank in that region. Ukrainian Deputy Defence Minister Hanna Maliar has also written on Telegram about the situation in Bakhmut, and this relates to what we're talking about with Prigozhin. Summary in plain language: the enemy continued to concentrate its main efforts in the east in order to reach the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. However, the enemy is unable to advance due to strong resistance of our defence forces. The situation is insignificant but somewhat changing. For several months in a row, the enemy advanced in the east in 4 directions, being Avdiivsky, Mariinsky, Limansky and Bakhmutsky. So Avdiivka, Mariinka, Liman and Bakhmut. Later, he predicted became active in 2 more areas, Shakatsky and Kupiansk. During this time, the enemy did not manage to reach the borders of Donetsk, Luhansk regions. The enemy is exhausted and is now replacing troops and regrouping. So this relates back to the British MOD. We're talking about the replacement from Wagner PMC to the VDV traditional conventional forces and the airborne forces. In all directions, the aggressor does not stop shelling and airstrikes. However, the geography of offensive actions is somewhat different. In 3 indicated directions, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Shakatsky, during the day, the enemy did not carry out offensive operations. At the same time, the enemy tried to return the lost positions of Bakhmutsky, but could not, although on any of the maps I've seen, there is no change in Bakhmut that I'm seeing, at least on the maps. On the other 3 directions, Kupiansk, Liman, Mariinka, the enemy is active and carries out rather intensive offensive actions, but without success. I spoke about yesterday, there was a lot of rumour that there was offensive clearing operations through Mariinka, but again, the maps hasn't shown any of those changes yet. The situation is conditionally stable. We control the southwestern outskirts of the city. The Wagnerites have not yet left the city. They carry out instructional work with the regular army units that have arrived. Now, this is something interesting. They say, but there's 2 bits interesting here. One, control the southwestern outskirts of the city. So Ukraine not yet has actually said that Bakhmut has fallen and still claims that the southwestern outskirts are under control. Now, I've seen no geolocated footage or map that actually show this, but that is the claim from here. But I think interestingly as well, the instructional work with regular army units. So if we have the British MOD, it does say the Wagner assault detachments. So it says, the Wagner assault detachment complete their withdrawal. So that is saying the assault detachment. It doesn't mean that these better trained guys aren't there to sighting guns, train the VDV, things like this coming in. So I thought that was interesting and something that I hadn't really considered. The enemy is shelling and carrying out airstrikes in the border areas with the Russian Federation. The enemy is on the defensive in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. I know that Russia is posturing mostly around the front line in defensive action. Since they have taken Bakhmut, we have seen that the posture has been defensive from the Russians and basically defensive from the Ukrainians. The actual territorial change has been absolutely minimal, as we assume that Ukraine is setting up for the counter-offensive and that Russia is setting up in defensive for those counter-offensive actions. Now, the long ongoing dispute between the leader of the Chechens, Kadyrov, and the leader of Wagner PMC, Prigozhin, is said to be mended. Now, today, Prigozhin posted an audio message on his Telegram channel in which he suggested the pair had come to an agreement. I got a call from Razman, who's Kadyrov. We talked and agreed that we would put a break on the whole story. The conflict is settled. Now, this is directly translated, but is not interpreted. There is a difference between translation and interpretation. But from the put a break on the whole story, this is interpreted as releasing the brakes on the offensive, releasing the brakes on the units and the way they act between themselves. But again, Prigozhin has taken to online to make many statements, and I believe this is all in somewhat of a game for Prigozhin to gain political points, as he's sort of cashing in on, well, if Russia win, then I will have many more operations planned for Wagner PMC because it will look good for them. Because you've got to remember, it doesn't matter what Wagner do or don't do. It's a business. Now, I'm not saying that ethics and whatever don't matter, but to Prigozhin, it's a business, and he needs to get the next contract for them to roll into. So if they win, then it'll look good. People will hire them. And if they lose, I fully believe that Prigozhin is looking for areas of political stance, and that's why he's building a massive following. People didn't know who Prigozhin either was. This is the whole any publicity is good publicity. You or I had no idea who Yevgeny Prigozhin was even in the beginning of this, but once Wagner PMC came on the block, if you're a bad guy looking to hire a PMC, probably look at that. Or as well as for politics, people know his name, people know successes, that he can sell things like this. I believe that he has political ambition. Either way that this war folds, and somewhat it may be even in his advantage if an area was to break up, whatever, Putin fall, maybe Prigozhin could be in line for that, but that's just my speculation. So this was from Our Wars today, and I can't really find this in many other places, but every time I have found it, it's the same. So Our Wars is very reliable on this, but just take everything, including what I say, everything with a grain of salt. So Wagner leader Prigozhin today. And translation, Governor Gladov announced in official channels that today 5 residents of the Belgorod region were killed. 16 more were injured. Why did we take Bakhmut and rename it after Movsk? Why are tens of thousands of people, our Russian guys, dying moving west in order for us to start giving away pieces of the Belgorod region, our native Russian land, step by step? Why is everyone silent about the deaths of these civilians? Where is General Lapin? That's the guy we saw last time with the Soviet patch commanding the troops there as well. Where is Shoigu? Where is Gerasimov? Where are their explanations to the Russian people that are giving up peaceful citizens and our territories to be torn to pieces? When will this silence and attempt to cover up the fate of Russian people end? Tell us their names and surnames. Tell us the place and date where the burial will be, so that we can take off our hats and honour their memory, and then decide how and when we will take revenge as well, like I just spoke about. That Prigozhin in this does show a lot of empathy towards the people, and is of course very empathetic towards any Russian deaths, including his own as well, and he's very, very pro-Russian Federation. And at the end of the day, this undermines these people, these other very powerful people he's speaking of, Gerasimov, Shoigu, things like that. Undermine them, can build his own popularity as more and more people are questioning the actual authority and competence of these people. Prigozhin's doing this, lifting himself up to the next level. And as well, talking about Belgorod, I believe that he might be looking for another in for his unit in that region. And of course, in Belgorod region, he would not lose as many people as, say, he did in Bakhmut, but would be able to show another win as well. As too, I thought this was a cool photo. We're going to talk about some more things about these in a second, but this is a Ukrainian Su-24 Mike fighter aircraft with 2 underslung Storm Shadow missiles, and I thought this was cool because it's not often you actually see these that have been adapted onto these planes and are firing. It's not actually so often you see them like in action like this, and the Storm Shadow has really been hitting some big targets, and like we spoke about yesterday, the Storm Shadow is having an effect on this. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before, but in History Legends' recent video, he brings up a point of Western troops and the lack of war-fighting combat experience and conventional experience. Now, from an infantryman myself, this is incredibly true, no matter what you think of History Legends or not, but this is incredibly true. The majority of instructors giving Ukrainian soldiers training would have either little to no combat experience, and with that, even less conventional warfare experience, and even less than a near-peer country like Russia. Now, is Russia a near-peer country to like the West, like America. No, but it is near peer to Ukraine. We thought Russia was near peer to the States, but that sort of got shifted, or we thought it was at least close. But the things that remain that near peer is the ICBM threat, which is a real threat and remains that it is sort of the silver bullet to the end of the world. So it creates a lot of issues. If Russia didn't have that, I believe this war would look very different with other boots on the ground. But I digress to talk about the common experience. This is why I've spoken in length about the training. Here goes both ways. The West is learning valuable lessons from their soldiers who have participated in combat in which Western soldiers haven't really seen since World War II and the Korean War. The experience since has mostly been unconventional warfare against asymmetric combatants. For example, your Great War on Terror. And as well in these operations, the West had complete air superiority and dominance. Now, this comes with its own challenges, of course. I'm not trying to take away anything from those brave men and women that fight in those, but the West does have very little experience in conventional modern warfare. Now, the West has a hell of a lot of equipment, and it has gained a hell of a lot of knowledge, not only from captured Russian equipment and being able to fully combat test our own weapon systems against an advanced military. Now, I know people will push back on this advanced military thing, but let's talk about it this way. Who we were fighting over the past 20 years, say the Taliban, didn't have major electronic warfare capability and EW capability that is really equivalent to ours. I've spoken to a lot of guys who work in the EW space and say that Russia's is very good. Now, if you say that, you're a Russian sympathiser, so whatever, just send your hate mail. I don't really give a shit at this point. Fighter aircraft, cruise missiles, ships like this, we haven't been fighting enemy with those things. But what we have gained is a lot of logistical experience of rapid deployment of equipment and gained a lot of command experience in conventional war. But this experience comes at the cost of young people's lives, and that should never be forgotten. But it needs to be remembered too that Russia has gained a lot of experience. So the point I'm trying to make is this is really a two-way street. The weapons availability, the traditional military skills may be more developed in NATO, the West, but the employment and deployment of those skills hasn't been around for decades. So that there's that experience the other way too, that the Ukrainians are coming maybe with the lesser traditional skills, lesser weapons, but absolutely have the experience of that. So don't think that there's not a sharing of information here, but it is very difficult in this to actually know what should be trained and how reactions will be to things like ongoing massive shelling. Now, Russia has had a lot of experience as well, but seemingly didn't learn from its mistakes. For example, the First Chechen War, the Battle of Grozny, really sealed the fate for so many and should have been a learning experience for tank and armoured warfare in Russia, as it was for us in the West. Due to a tank's low depression, elevation of their gun, and limited visibility. The visibility of a tank is not like a bloody car. They essentially got slaughtered in an urban environment. In the first day, 800 of 1,000 men died. Now, when my unit, being the 7th Battalion, went from a light infantry, sort of on foot, to mechanised infantry, we studied this, the first thing we did, of the failure of, because we were becoming armoured mechanised, the failure of mechanised armoured vehicles in an urban environment. And in the beginning of this, we saw Russia do basically the same mistake of what they should have learned in battles like that. And battles, we can bring up a lot of history about mistakes made which haven't learned from as well. But that said, Russia is taking less armour and aircraft losses recently, and this could be a sign of adaptation or just less offensive action. This could be a reason of why delays to counteroffensives could be very dangerous. Yes, every day Ukraine is getting stronger, but so does your foe. Russia's training establishments, recruitment, from your conscript guys to your special forces, haven't just ended. They're still running, and the build-up of defensive works is going on all the time. The West should have been able to see this war coming a mile off, as a lot of people just in the civilian world had said. When I was in Ukraine, even before the war, people said, well, it is coming at some stage, and they should have been able to arm Ukraine earlier on in the stages where Russia, essentially in the first couple of weeks, maybe months, essentially had its pants down juggling too many balls in the air. That would have been the time to strike and have that counteroffensive, not once that had time to gain experience, gain knowledge, and dig in defensive measures. Like I said, Russia has had time to develop their tactics, defensive works, and also counters for a lot of systems. There are some systems which we don't see talked about anymore because of the EW warfare has made them null and void. The longer this is delayed, the more bloody it will be for both sides. At this stage, nothing is a sure thing, except for that tens to hundreds of thousands more will be killed in this ongoing conflict. There's been photos of a Russian train appearing to be bringing Russian T-80 Bravo Victors out of long-term storage and possibly be brought into the fold of the war. From this, we could potentially see more T-80 tanks being reactivated and brought into the war. Compared to the T-72, the T-80 wasn't as successfully exported to other countries, as it has a gas turbine engine, which was a lot more hungry on fuel than the regular diesel, and a number of other reasons. And T-72s were exported just absolutely everywhere, and it wasn't that much of a step up. As a result, Russia may actually have a lot of spare parts and hulls for T-80s, although the availability and condition is definitely questionable. But the idea that Russia is running out of tanks is a lot more complex than it seems. Now, the defense of Ukraine claim they've destroyed over 3,800 Russian tanks, although none of these numbers appear to have any verification. Oryx, who visually confirm everything, say it's just over 2,000, which is a hell of a lot. But Russia has a hell of a lot of tanks, as tanks were a staple for the Soviet Union, especially in a different time of war. Now, getting accurate numbers is very difficult. Getting accurate numbers on how many tanks Russia actually has that are operational or in storage is very difficult. But from some stuff pre-22, because after the invasion, everything's just got bloody muddled up with, who knows what's going on. But it was about 3,000 operational and about 10,000 in storage. These are different variants, although the majority have been T-72s. The real question with the ones that are in storage is what standard are they in? What is the actual condition? Are these able to be brought up to a combat standard and used in warfare, as some have absolutely just fallen into disrepair or been scavenged out for parts or sold off through corruption? For the hard parts of a tank, there is no question that Russia is still a huge industrial power and can make these parts. Where the problems lie is for what I call the soft parts, the thermals, the sights, the chips, things like that, as sanctions have specifically targeted these industries. But either way, we will continue to see Russian tanks rolling into the front lines for some time. They still have a lot. Not only tanks rolling in the traditional role, but we will see a lot of these tanks that are, pretty run down. We will probably start seeing them used in more of an artillery space. This requires far less crew, maintenance, equipment, in the tank, as it can basically be a shell with a gun and work as artillery. Yes, there are issues with this, such as the barrel life and accuracy, but, just for rolling artillery by sheer quantity, which is what we see Russia really use, this will definitely have an impact as well. And we've seen many countries use this before, of older variant tanks in areas of artillery and more modern variants in the traditional role of tanks working with the infantry. Now, there are some more common illusions that I see that tanks are obsolete and that the Russian tanks are basically scrap metal. This is simply, on the whole, at least the majority, just not true. Tanks are not obsolete on the modern battlefield, although just like every battle where tanks have been involved, they come with unique obstacles that need to be taken into account in planning, and Russia has not been good at this, at least in the initial stages of the war. In the initial stages, Russia lost so many tanks because the initial invasion was not conducted as a combined arms operation with ground infantry, other armoured vehicles, air support, things like this that are absolutely crucial when it comes to armoured warfare. The critical piece in this is infantry support, and this makes up for what a tank lacks. The biggest weakness of a tank is visibility, movement of how quick the gun is, and sheer numbers. There's not that many of them, but this is where infantry protect them from the opposing infantry forces of their anti-tank weapons, particularly in urban terrain. And also just as critical is the air support, air superiority for these tanks, and that just simply didn't exist at the time, although there are many stories that the tank commanders were told that they had air superiority, therefore they moved in ways of which they may not have if they knew they didn't have air superiority, even down to people saying that the crews didn't actually know that they were rolling into that battle space. And people will say, oh, that's just a rumour, but you see a captured, 18-year-old young lad tank driver. I don't believe that guy would actually have the ability to make up and hold with a lie like that. Yeah, if it was some Spetsnaz dude, some FSB guy, yeah, they may be able to uphold that. But if it's just some scared, shitless 18-year-old ripped out of a tank who said, I didn't even know we were doing this. We just started copying rounds and then we just drove where we could. We thought we were being supported, whatever. I think some of that is able to believe, and we should look into where those problems went down so we can avoid that in the future as well. But the majority of tank deaths we have seen were in the first 50 days. More than half of the lost tanks occurred in these 50 days. And this makes sense, because Russia pushed the hardest in those, but it also could show that tactics are improving. And this lies as well with Russia's fighter aircraft. We do see a lot of older variants of Russian tanks, and on the whole, yes, a Russian T-series tank is not as good as a modern Western tank, especially for things like crew protection. But the idea that these are simply scrap metal is just a myth. They were more so developed before some of these anti-tank guided munitions were really in powers, things like NLAWs, javelins like that. So the tank is working differently, the protection is differently. But if tanks were obsolete and T-series tanks were not useful, we would not have seen Ukraine campaigning for months for Western tanks, and many hanging their hat on that this is a game changer for the offensives. And this does include as well the transfer of T-series modernised tanks from countries that operated these or had them in storage to Ukraine as well. Now, Russia's ATGMs, the anti-tank guided munitions, have not been shown to be as effective as things like the NLAW and Javelin. But it is worth saying as well, the majority of tank kills that we have seen are not from these weapons. The majority are still from artillery. Now, I know some of these videos recently may just be a bit of me rambling talking about stuff, but what's really happening in Ukraine? Not very much. We're sort of waiting for things to start moving. So I'll take this opportunity to talk about some stuff that's on my mind, maybe give a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, and do what we can. But I need to keep this rolling on along as well. So Legends, if you'd like to support me, links down below. Never feel obliged. I really appreciate it either way. So thank you very much. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you in the next video. Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.